So I'm going to ask these fine scholars some questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, because I'm sure that you all will have many questions once we have finished our conversation. So where I'd like to start is in your beginnings. I don't know who wants to answer this question first, but what was the spark that got you really interested in history, and specifically Black history?
So for me, I think the answer comes from my parents. They, specifically my dad, was someone who was interested in history, though I can look back and say it wasn't necessarily real history. So he was, and not to call him out or anything, but he was really interested in the idea of ancient Egypt and how Black Americans related to ancient Egypt and how ancient Egyptians were Black in a way that verged on pseudo-history. And it's a very common movement in the Black community to tie us back to ancient Egypt, even though many Black people came from West Africa. And there was a book by Ivan Van Sertima called They Came Before Columbus. And that was a book that was always on the mantle. There was also a huge ancient Egypt book that was always on the mantle. So my first interest in Black history was actually ancient Egyptian history, if you can call it that. And when I got to college, I actually took a few classes in archaeology first. And I started to learn more about the actual rigorous ways in which you can use data and empiricism and logic to form conclusions about people's history. And I started to apply that with the actual political movements that were happening. So this, when I was in college, revolved around the Black Lives Matter movement. It revolved around affirmative action. And I started to use, oddly enough, the interest that I had in ancient Egyptian history and debunking things to debunk mistruths that I was hearing in the news, to debunk mistruths that I was hearing in college and other spaces online from other influencers. So I always approached history with this critical eye, and it really came from trying to understand things that were told to me that might not be true, and how I can uncover and find truths in other places in history.
No, thank you for that. You know, I'm a little older than Kahlil, but we share a tie in the fact that my mother's, I'm a native New Yorker, but I'm the child of immigrants who came to the United States from Haiti in 1966. And I'm born in Sac-Passé, Naboulé. I'm born in 1972 myself. So my mother was, she worked at Mount Sinai Hospital on East 92nd Street, and she was part of SEIU 1199. And so I was on my first picket line 45 years ago in New York City at the age of 7. And it was the first of many times being, in demonstrations and picket lines and marches in the city. So my mom was my first history teacher, my first history professor. She was a feminist. She was a radical, revolutionary Christian humanist. She was an ethicist. She passed away 2 years ago of cancer. But she's the first person who introduced me and my older brother to history, to Haitian history, to the history of the Haitian Revolution and what that meant and how that reverberated globally in the United States and all around the world. And so for me, history was always something that you could connect to social movements. And so for me, I'm first gen, and I never would have thought that I would be a professor or any of this stuff. So I thought I was going to be just organizing. And I went to State University of New York at Stony Brook, when tuition, when I started in fall 1990, was $675. That's how much tuition was, $675. The room was more, but it was definitely affordable, and it was there that I was a history major, but I was also a Black Studies major. And one of my professors was Amiri Baraka, but there were other professors, Olufemi Vaughn, Nigerian brother, who became a big mentor, Les Owens, Flores Cash. All these Black women and men really mentored me and nurtured me, read my writing, and really cultivated me and said, you should get a PhD. And I ended up being an undergrad for only 3 years, and started a PhD program right before my 21st birthday because these people were pushing me. I started a PhD program in American history at Temple University. But so I'm always thinking about history as not just a scholar, but as an activist, because when we were on picket lines, and here's a great anecdote. So we grew up in Brooklyn and Jamaica, Queens, and until we had our union went out on another strike, we had no dental care. We had never gone to the dentist. This is not Mississippi. This is not Alabama. This is New York City. We had never gone to the dentist. In fact, we were getting our teeth pulled out. That's what we were getting our teeth pulled out, right? So this is real talk. And even when I saw, like when Ferguson happened, when they were really initially, before they sanitized stuff, interviewing people, black folks in Ferguson, you should have seen the number of teens and young people they were interviewing who had missing teeth in Ferguson. Missing teeth, right, in a major American city. And these weren't people who could afford braces or even afford dental visits. I relate to that. I've experienced that. But once we went out on strike, we got dental care, and my mom was like, we're all going to the dentist. So this is real talk. In the United States, in the 1980s, in the same city that I was in, New York City, Eleanor Bumpus, 66-year-old black woman, grandmother, was shot and murdered by the NYPD. Murdered, not killed, but murdered. Michael Griffith, when I was 14, was murdered by a white mob in Howard Beach, Queens. Murdered, not accidentally killed, but murdered. But the positive of all this growing up was, one, it toughens you up. So one, it toughens you up. But two, we always resisted and utilized the history to resist. So my family was not an apathetic family. We were a political family, and my mother was proudly political, but her politics were rooted in an understanding of history. And last thing, the books we had at home, Jean Price Mars, the Haitian philosopher, but also my mom made it a point for me and my brother to read both Angela Davis's autobiography, and we were 5th and 7th grade, but also C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobin. So that's the house I grew up in. That's a tough scenario to grow up in. And my mom loved to debate. She loved to argue. She loved to disagree with you, too. So you were expected to argue. You were expected to make your case, but you made your case rooted in history.
Thank you. So,
Thank you.
So,
2014, after Michael Brown's death. So Ferguson's going to be 2014. Yes.
So Kahlil, can I ask you when and how did you know that you wanted a career as a historian?
Yeah, so when I came into college, I was not actually super interested in history. I came into college with the goal of finding a good job, finding a good career. And originally that was through computer science. So I was doing computer science class, and I just remember there was one time where I did this coding homework assignment, and I was stuck in my room, and right outside the window I could see everyone else like playing soccer, and then this was the first week of school too, so I was making no friends, and I just knew that wouldn't work for me. I'm too social of a person. So from there I pivoted to economics and political science, and it wasn't until I sat in on a history course by a professor. It was about the Cold War, and he framed history in his lecture as this sort of like spy movie plot between all of these Western empires and countries like America trying to destabilize countries in Africa, but then you have leaders like Thomas Sankara and leaders in Ghana, Nigeria, leading these revolutionary movements to liberate their countries from Britain, from France, from Germany. And I thought that was so interesting. It was like it was like watching a movie. So I started taking history courses, and at some point I didn't necessarily have a plan, but I just knew that I wanted to do something with history. So I started taking more of those courses. I built it up. It became my major. And luckily enough, it was actually on a random morning right after COVID. I had TikTok. TikTok, for anyone who doesn't know, in 2020 is the app that took off because while teenagers and young people were mostly at home, there was no way to engage with each other except through social media. So that's why you see this correlation between this pandemic and the rise of social media like TikTok. And there was a few moments throughout 2020 because of the George Floyd murder where people were using it for advocacy, though originally TikTok was a app where people would post themselves dancing. So all you would see is like dance challenges. There was nothing intellectual, nothing insightful happening on that app. But there was a few people here and there who would just record a video of them showing active police violence or showing a protest. And in 2021, on January 17th, it was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And on Twitter, not TikTok, I came across the FBI posting a tweet that said, "Happy MLK Day." And it had gone viral because a few comments underneath were saying, like, it's so ironic the FBI, of all people, were posting this. So I made a TikTok video that day. I just filmed myself not dancing or anything else, just talking straight to the camera, saying it's ironic that the FBI was celebrating or is wishing everyone a happy MLK Day when they actively were trying to kill MLK and tried to blackmail him into committing suicide in order to stop his activism. And I told that story. It was actually one of my professors, Beverly Gage, who had done a biography of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI in the 1950s that had recently uncovered it. So I cited her work, made a video, and within an hour and a half, it had over 1 million views of people 18 and younger commenting, "I never knew this, like it's blowing my mind." It was at this time where people were really becoming aware of racial injustice, but they didn't know how nefarious it was. So then I started a series called Hidden History, where I covered the creepy, crazy, and covered up parts of American history that you never learned about in school or anywhere else. So that was the name of a series. I have now over like 200, 300 episodes. There's never-ending stories that you can fit into that category. And within 3 months, the New York Times actually profiled me for my work. And it was based off of my TikTok and also my time as student body president of Yale. And the title of the article was "A Black Student That Makes and Teaches Black History." And from there, a Hollywood agent reached out, and that's when I knew I could make a career out of it.
So I have a question. Most of us, when we think about history and we think about our experiences with history, it's usually rote memory, people, places, times, events, maybe some interpretation, but often not. But when you think about each of your respective works and your platforms, how do you define your work as a historian?
Yeah, so I mean, I think history is really about storytelling, right? And I think one of the reasons why we are in such bad shape right now as a society and as a world, it's about storytelling. And this is where not only black folks are very key, but Africa is very key. Because what people don't understand is that storytelling is much more powerful than written words. Storytelling is what shapes societies. It's what shapes culture. It's what shapes politics. So in the United States, we have, since the Civil War, 2 competing stories about American history. One is a story of multiracial democracy, which is the Reconstructionist narrative of American history. And the other is a story of white supremacy and the Confederacy. And that's the story that we're being told right now, straight up from the White House. And so those are the battles, and where history, and this is where Baldwin, James Baldwin, who I'm writing a book on Baldwin now, but Baldwin was one of the characters in Freedom Season. Baldwin has a great quote about how history is literally present in each one of us. And that is really brilliant, and it's really profound. So all history is even more than events and characters and narratives. History is the way in which we interpret our experiences. And the first histories we learn are familial ones. Our parents, my daughters have asked me too, how did I come here? When they're, especially my 10-year-old, like, how did you have me? How did you make me? And those are very complicated answers, right? So wanting to know literally how was I made, but how did we come here? How did the family come here, both from my side and her mom? And so what's so interesting about history is that the first history we have is a family history where we tell our people, we tell our kids where we're from, whether that's from Alabama, Texas, Maryland, but then they say, where else are we from, right? And then for so much of American history, black folks weren't proud to be like, well, we're also from West Africa because of how we came in terms of a politics of the transatlantic slave trade and how we came against our will, right? So when we think about history, the power of it, and this is where, again, Africa is much more powerful and, to me, cognizant of the power of history and storytelling than Europe, is that when you think about where we're at today, the high point of the heroic period of the civil rights movement is 1963. And the reason why the civil rights movement was successful, and that launches a 50-year racial justice era, is that we're able to tell ourselves a story about the country where it's the Reconstructionists who win that narrative war. And they defeat, for a time, those advocates of white supremacy and black dehumanization and immiseration, right? And so what's so important about storytelling is that even now, the stories and the lies people are telling about black people, about gay people and queer and trans people, about immigrants, there's anti-Semitism and there's also anti-Palestinian and anti-Muslim rhetoric. Those stories are not actually a lot of times even related. You see, they're trying to stop me from telling you the story, right? You see that, right? Those stories are actually not necessarily related to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and even the history books that are written. People are making stuff up on the fly, and tens of millions are believing them. That's the power of storytelling. And that social media has amplified and exacerbated, but that predates social media. So what's important for all of us to understand is that we're engaged in a Geist war, a spirit war that has to do with storytelling. And it's important for black people, I think, to understand that even as, yes, we should have a critique of white supremacy and racial injustice, we also have to tell ourselves a story of how we're going to look beyond that racial injustice, right? We have to tell ourselves a positive story for those of us who are parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, just for the future of those children. So storytelling is really, really the key, and history becomes the building block of all the stories that the world tells. But the problem is, right now, we're in a period where disinformation is also infiltrating that history and allowing people to spin what we used to call back in the day whoppers. They're spinning lies, right? And that's what you have a president who can go to the United Nations and just start lying, right? And so this is like real talk. And that's very, very difficult for all of us, because usually people in power, even if they were embellishing, they weren't straight up lying in the exact manner that people are lying today.
So Kahlil, I wanted you touched on your viral rise, we'll call it, to the top, and I would like to congratulate you. For those of you who don't keep up with social media, you are looking at one of Time Magazine's 2025 most influential people on the internet, Mr. Kahlil Greene. And so I know you talked a little bit about your platform and how your initial sort of foray into using TikTok in this way. And of course, you could have built a platform doing anything, like you said, dancing. I mean, if you dance, of course. But, and obviously having a warm reception to that initial post was helpful. But what else really compelled you to want to focus on history and building your platform. And I also know that you have some work that you do with National Geographic, so I think we'd love to hear about that work as well.
So outside of like the reasons I've talked about so far for getting into history, I think one thing that always interested me was being disruptive. So for anyone who doesn't, no worries. For anyone who doesn't know, yeah, on the word disruptive. For anyone who doesn't know, TikTok is a very fast-moving social media. So you think of the news cycle as like something happens and like a week later people forget. On TikTok, it's a matter of hours, like 5 hours, 6 hours, maybe 12 hours you have to comment on any one thing that's happening. And most people will use this to just say whatever their opinion is off their heads, or just say the most aggravating thing, the thing to rile up and get the most likes or the most follows and the most shares. But to counter that, which is something that I saw as an issue, I always wanted to come in with something at least partially intellectual or informative. So even something as recent as I can hopefully talk about it, Charlie Kirk's murder, there was a lot of conversations being had around how barbaric, let's say for example, how barbaric it was that young people, specifically young people of color, young progressives, were making jokes about his death, which is something that was happening on the internet. And one thing that I wanted to interject and say was, at the very least, you can't blame these young black people or these young progressives for starting this sort of morbid trend of making fun of people dying, because I was 12 years old, and when Trayvon Martin was killed, you had young white teenagers doing the Trayvon Martin challenge, where they would lie dead with Skittles and Coke in their hand to making fun of Trayvon Martin's death. You also had something called the George Floyd challenge, where white teenagers were kneeing each other on their necks and joking about it. And this is all to say that the culture of making fun of people dying and of violence on the internet is something that started with white supremacy. So if we're going to castigate it when it comes from the quote-unquote left, then we should have done this years ago when white supremacists were doing it to the young black people who were dying. So that's just an example of the way that I would like to interject on social media. And I think that sort of shifting the narrative or being disruptive, providing an intervention, has been very fruitful, both for my work and I think for people who are watching my work, because so often, even on social media, where you have hundreds of thousands of people giving an opinion, that opinion will be so similar. Like it'll feel like people are just repeating what the other person's saying. There's a kind of like a hive mind behind a lot of the conversations happening. So I always want to be that person that's bringing in the sort of third perspective or the other opinion, grounded in facts, grounded in history, grounded in storytelling, as you say. And that's one way that I try to do advocacy and activism through history and through my platform.
More congratulations are in order, because in addition to our most influential person on the internet, we also have a 2025 Carnegie Fellow with us, recently named Dr. Joseph. So, you have been they don't want me to talk about you either. You've been a leading voice and scholar on Black Power and for the last 2 decades, and you have a new book out, Freedom Season, that explores the transformative period of 1963 that leads to landmark civil rights legislation. So what led you to this period of exploration? And as our audience who will be reading this book and others who will be watching us who will be reading, what are some things you would like them to take away that are applicable in our present moment?
So thank you. So I think what led to Freedom Season is just the work that I've been doing on the civil rights Black Power eras. Before this, I did a book called The Third Reconstruction, which looked at 3 periods of Reconstruction in American history, including the 60s, the 1950s and 60s as America's second Reconstruction. And I did a dual biography of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. as well that found me in the 60s. And I did a biography of Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, who popularized the term Black Power. and a book on the Black Power movement as well. And so in all those books, I always ran into really interesting people and historical events in 1963, but because of the way in which those books were framed, I had to always move on, right? Because one thing you find out as a writer very quickly is the projects that you do have a lot of limitations just by taking on a biography. And you say, okay, I'm gonna do somebody's birth to death. So you're trapped in the limitations of the project, right? And so doing a book on a whole year was really interesting. One, it was a challenge because I had never done that before, but it gave me a lot more room to look at 63 in a much more nuanced way, right? So you could really say, okay, instead of having to move on, you're actually looking at weeks and months and sometimes days in a very, very local way. And it let me look at certain people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. in different ways, but then it let me bring in new people. James Baldwin is a thread, but Lorraine Hansberry, the brilliant black feminist writer and playwright. It let me look at Gloria Richardson from Cambridge, Maryland, brilliant local civil rights leader and what she was doing all throughout 1963, Diane Nash. It let me look at the Kennedy brothers in different ways, in very, very specific ways that this book talks about John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, and allows me to see where they are faltering, but also where they succeed, right? So you get a real complex landscape of this period of time. And so what I found out looking at 63, which is also the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, was just what a cataclysmic year it was. Like we usually think about 1968, and I'm sure Kahlil would agree that 68 is one of the most talked about years in the civil rights movement and in the Black Power era because of the assassinations of King, the Black Panthers, the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy. So there's a lot. And the urban rebellions that are happening all throughout. Over 125 cities erupt after Dr. King's assassination. But 63 is really the key moment and the key year of the civil rights movement's heroic period in the Second Reconstruction, because it's that year that the activism of people like Medgar and Myrlie Evers, it's that year the activism of people like James Baldwin, it's that year the activism of the young people who are students in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So Ruby Doris Smith, Stokely Carmichael, Diane Nash, so many different black women and men, some who are very, very young. The young people in Birmingham who are being arrested during the so-called Children's Crusade, thousands who are being arrested. King's letter from Birmingham jail. Baldwin's The Fire Next Time comes out January 31st, 1963. So there's so much happening that I thought it was a year that was understudied and that I needed to write about. In terms of lessons, very quickly, I mean, I think one of the big lessons is that 63 is a year where four things are really crystallized and debated, but become part of the narrative, that storytelling. It's these ideas of dignity, citizenship, freedom, and multiracial democracy. So dignity, the way in which activists in 63 define dignity is something that all people have, it's God-given and they're born with, right? But they define citizenship as merely the external recognition of that dignity. And they spend the whole year linking those concepts. Baldwin does it, Malcolm X does it in a fierce way. Dr. King does it in Letter from Birmingham Jail. Gloria Richardson does it. Lorraine Hansberry does it during the 3-hour meeting with Bobby Kennedy, where the black folks end up in a screaming match with the Attorney General because he doesn't recognize black dignity as of yet. Because Bobby Kennedy, there's a mythology about Kennedy who becomes this civil rights champion by 68 in the 82-day presidential campaign before he's assassinated, shot in the head in California right after winning the California Democratic National Primary, and dies the next morning, brain dead, right? But Kennedy in 63 is not the same Kennedy who's saying he's a civil rights champion by 68, right? And so what's so interesting is that this idea of dignity and citizenship becomes really a gift that black people give to America by reimagining what those things can be, but also by reimagining what terms like freedom mean. And finally, this idea of multiracial democracy. What is it? The country only becomes a multiracial democracy after the Civil War, but we lose the narrative war. So we lose the people who, the South loses the Civil War, but they win the peace. That's what we've got to teach our kids. They win the peace, and that's why the textbooks are so racist. That's why you have the Confederate statues, not the ones that they built in the 50s. We're talking about the ones they built in the 19th century, right after the Civil War. That was happening, right? It's way before Stone Mountain, right? So what's so interesting is that what 63 gives you is multiracial democracy, where John F. Kennedy comes out and says he's in support of civil rights on June 11th, 1963, where James Baldwin is pushing people to say it's a moral issue, where Dr. King, in Letter from Birmingham Jail, says the biggest obstacle to black freedom is not white supremacists, it's white liberals who are moral cowards. This is Dr. King's language. He says that white liberals are morally reprehensible and politically indefensible because they don't believe in the humanity of black people. Because he knows that white conservatives don't believe in that humanity. But this is King saying this in Letter from Birmingham Jail. So it's really extraordinary year. It's kind of like a, oh snap, that's what we used to say back in the day, year, right? And then finally, the 6 children who are murdered in Birmingham. So it's the 4 girls, and I'm gonna just say their names very, very quickly. And then there's 2 boys. And James Baldwin really becomes a prophetic figure and a man on fire after their murders. Carol Robertson, Addie Mae Collins, and Cynthia Wesley, who are 14 years old, and Denise McNair, who's 11. And then 13-year-old Virgil Peanut Ware is shot by 2 white Eagle Scouts on his bike and murdered. And then 20-year-old Johnny Robinson is murdered by the Birmingham Police Department. This is all on September 15th, 1963. After this, James Baldwin calls it a day. James Baldwin calls for a Christmas boycott. And James Baldwin, even after the Kennedy assassination, is basically saying what Malcolm X has said, that it's the chickens coming home to roost. This is Baldwin. Baldwin, who had been talking about a grand aspirational republic in The Fire Next Time. Baldwin, who had said at the end of that book that now is the time to come together, end the racial nightmare, and achieve our country. Baldwin starts to talk about black political power, radical political self-determination, and really say that this whole country, in many ways, is not the country he thought it could be. After 6 children are murdered, and in his mind, not enough happens after the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. One more thing. After the Kennedy assassination, what the Kennedy assassination allows the country to do is tell itself a different story about itself. Kennedy becomes connected to the martyrs that year, the black people who died, those 6 children, Medgar Evers. Kennedy's death opens up a new way to tell the American story, even if people like Baldwin say it's an unearned way, but politically we benefit. We benefit from telling ourselves a story that JFK was this civil rights champion. It lets LBJ pass the Civil Rights Act that some people want ended right now, right? And so very, very important in terms of storytelling, 1963, and what we can get out of it today.
Thank you. So speaking of right now, one of the things that this conversation is supposed to focus on is Gen Z and their engagement with Black history. And of course, both of you scholars have engagements with Gen Z and Black history. And so, this is a very diverse cohort in terms of, coverage of age. We've got Gen Z's, you all are getting close to 30 now. not to put you on the spot, but you are getting close to 30, but then there's some who are still bringing up the rear and they are just entering their early teens. And so from your different perspectives, how do you see Gen Z's interest and engagement with Black history? How are you sort of seeing this play out right now? Oh.
Very quickly, I would say that I interact with Gen Z as my students at University of Texas at Austin. And also when I'm invited to speak on college campuses, and also through some nonprofit work that I do as well. And I would say that the difference between the students I teach now and the students that I taught when I first started teaching university students, which goes back to 1998 when I first started teaching university students, is that the students today are much more creative about how they want to interact with what you're teaching them, right? And so in a lot of ways, the idea of storytelling and history, it's sort of like they want to both engage in the archive, but connect the archive to the real world, which actually is very, very exciting. I think one of the things that's more difficult is the textual archive and just reading the way we did, in the sense of saying, I used to assign like a ton of reading, and I still assign reading, but I do it in different ways now, right? Than when I was coming up and when I first started teaching, right? And I also try to be more interactive than I got as a student, right? So it's kind of like going places, showing presidential libraries, teaching even undergrads what archival work is. What does it mean to go to an archive, request materials, and then how do you examine those materials? And how do you source those materials, and how do you parse out materials that you think are sort of verifiable from materials that might be sort of part of an official record, but just there to amplify sort of one point of view, right? So, yeah, I'll stop there.
So my interaction with Gen Z largely happens on social media, quite obviously, and I think that it can be pretty representative of Gen Z as a whole. So unlike a lot of people were predicting back in 2020, Gen Z is a pretty comparatively conservative cohort. Usually the thought is that younger people are more progressive, that they're more leftist, whatever you, socialist, whatever you want to call it. But Gen Z is not like that, especially after this previous election. People are seeing that. And the Gen Z Black community, the Gen Z, like people of color, like they're not necessarily adherents of these ideas that might have been understood to be true no matter what. So for example, you have a lot of Black Gen Z conservative commentators who are going out there and saying, we don't need affirmative action, racism is over. Or just because I'm Black doesn't mean we have anything in common. There's so many different things. There's names. Candace Owens is not Gen Z specifically, but she speaks to Gen Z. There are other names like C.J. Pearson, Xavier Durousseau, and so many others. There's women Gen Zers who are saying, I'm not a feminist, I don't believe in feminism. So I think as a Gen Zer who talks about social advocacy and history in the way that I do, you have to be able to communicate at such a basic level and go over and explain things in a clear way, like some of the elementary things about society, because even that's being attacked. Like we can't just go in and have a conversation about systemic racism, because if you're on a podcast with a conservative, they're gonna just say, you're using big words that doesn't mean anything, and they'll laugh you out of the room. And in the comments, that person will probably get most of the people agreeing with them, because a lot of the conversations we've had about race, about oppression in society, about discrimination, for very good reason, they're very high level because they've built on the work of people going back to the 60s, going back to the 1800s. But right now, we're in an age of anti-intellectualism, which means people are very happy being dumb. and they're very happy being intellectually lazy. Yeah, and and not only are they happy about it, but they make a lot of money from it. They get famous from it. They get rich from it. They get memorialized for it. They get holidays and resolutions passed for them being ignorant and hateful for their opinions. So I'm at a place where interacting with Gen Z means being able to take a step back and like be humble and really test a lot of the premises that I have. Understand that this cohort is very diverse. These are not all black people whose parents grew up in the black church in the South or lived through the civil rights movement. They're coming from all over the world. Many of them are very conservative back in their home countries. They bring that conservatism to America, and they look down on the civil rights movement. They look down on the black people who descend from those who were involved in the civil rights movement. So it's an uphill battle, to be honest. And I think one thing that I try to do to answer the question that you posed earlier about the work that I was doing with National Geographic, it just really goes down to like getting really into history, because a prominent form of communication when it comes to race and racism has been through the sociology lens, the lens of using these terms like internalized racism, systemic racism, microaggressions, and I think that those have a very important purpose when we're talking to each other because we understand them, but when we're fighting for the mainstream or fighting for public opinion, you just can't be that high level. And history is one way that you can communicate a lot of the same ideas, but through a way that everyone can understand because it is a story. So for National Geographic, what I did is I produced a 4-part docuseries called Hidden History, which is the same name as the TikTok series that I do. And what we did is we went to 4 different cities, Boston, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, and San Francisco, and we talked about in each city 4 or 5 sort of harrowing, really visceral, almost horrific tales of injustice that happened. I didn't even use the word injustice, I just said like bad things that happened, to in a very elementary way show that our country was built off of horrible, horrible injustice, horrible forms of oppression that many people didn't even know about. So there's, for example, I'm from DC, there's a black neighborhood called Anacostia. That's a very prominent black neighborhood in DC. Frederick Douglass lived there. And it's named Anacostia after the Anacostan Native Americans who lived in that area. And recently, not recently, but a few decades ago, they found artifacts from these Native Americans underneath the White House, and they just like buried it. Like no one ever really talked about it. And we went into the archives, we went to these communities, and we uncovered that there was a whole thriving community of Native Americans there that were specifically murdered so that the land could be used for tobacco growth, and then who was brought in to grow that tobacco? Black people. So we talk about how there's like, once again, terms that we could use like solidarity or intertwined oppression, whatever, but I just want to get at the heart of it, which are these stories of injustice. In DC alone, we talked about the first Uncle Tom, who was actually a man who escaped from slavery and helped more black people than Harriet Tubman escape from slavery, but he was later maligned because a white author sought to sanitize his legacy in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And just stories like that, I think, are more worthy of the conversation right now when it comes to young people, because young people are happy being simple, which is like once again, a sad thing. So I just try to not want to say to dumb stuff down, simplify things so that people can accept them where they're at.
Thank you. So I think what we hear is right now, in all times, history is hard. Right now is particularly hard as we're facing censorship and there's concerted efforts to erase histories and absent certain histories. And so I want to go all the way back to my very first question, which was, what was the spark that got you started? But what is the thing that keeps you going now?
Well, I'd say, I'm a relentless optimist. So I'd say my family keeps me going. My youngest, my 10-year-old, Aya loves history, and we talk about all of this all the time, and she knows what I do for a living. And I think that we have to have hope, and we find hope in the work and getting together like this. Sharing our experiences, sharing our stories with each other, and also knowing that when we think about the histories that we study, we've been through similar challenges and similar trials. I think every generation has to face up to their own challenges and trials. So I don't like comparing across generations, but we certainly know that previous generations faced difficult times, and their difficult times are not exactly our difficult times. This thing we're facing, this is us. What we just saw at the United Nations didn't happen when Dr. King was alive and Malcolm X was alive. It didn't, and Rosa Parks was alive, right? So we're in something new, but we've been in very difficult situations before, and we've come out and we've flourished and we've thrived and we've helped the entire country. So I think I'm one who, what's keeping me going is, Black people and then people who are in solidarity with us more than allyship. But I think we have to be really relentlessly positive, even as we're aware of all the dangers, right? Because we have to tell ourselves a story that allows us to still not just cope, but to thrive and to flourish, right? So even I think that's where I think social media, like the type that Kahlil does, I love and think is great. I think us on social media saying, "I told you so," about this sinking ship doesn't help us. It doesn't. I don't think it helps us psychologically. I think it doesn't help us spiritually, because I'm a Christian. I grew up a Christian. I remain a Christian, right? So part of it is that I agree with Dr. King in terms of saying that we can't get into a thing where we have enemy politics, right? The big thing should be, even with people who you completely disagree with, hey, we're not on the same team. You're thinking about collectively, how do we build this beloved community, right? Which is really, really important. But just psychologically for ourselves, it's really important, right? Toni Morrison said that racism prevents us from doing work, right? It's a distraction. It prevents us from doing all this beautiful artistry and loving our kids and loving each other, right? Because we got this thing, this wall that's right there, getting us mad, getting us stressful. Racism literally kills us, right? It literally kills, right? There's all this great Linda Villarosa's book on medical and health effects, right? So part of it is on us to be relentlessly positive. Those of us with more resources, like I always explain to my students, we can be more positive. But I will say, as somebody who grew up with not a lot of resources, I lived in a household where the positivity helped even when you didn't have the resources. So we didn't suddenly become positive once we could visit the dentist, and we were angry all those other years because I couldn't visit the dentist till I was a teenager. So we had good times and we couldn't visit the dentist. We had good times and hot water was cut off. We had good times and electricity was cut off. We had good times still, right? So part of it, this is how I'm able to, because I know my own experience, and my own experience is not a gilded, a gilded experience growing up, but it's one where my mother instilled dignity in us, right? And we use that dignity to shield us from negative things, and that's what we should be trying to do right now.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Kahlil?
Well, as I said earlier, I think being a young person on social media and being a young person in the world today, you just see so much injustice happening. And I think a lot of that injustice is centered on the idea of misinformation and disinformation, because there's always been lies told about Black people, about civil rights, whatever have you, but I don't think there's ever been, I know for a fact there's never been a time in history where that information has been able to spread as fast and as wide as it can with the usage of social media and media in general, and also how entrenched these ideas are in these like echo chambers of people only hearing the same opinions from the same people and believing that just because they see on the internet that it's true. With AI nowadays, people can doctor entire videos. They can make it seem like people are saying things that they're not saying. This has happened recently with, there was a killing that happened in I want to say Charleston, South Carolina, where people were doctoring quotes of a Black person who killed a white person saying, "I got that white girl," but the actual audio you can't hear. They were just putting those quotes on to start a race war. So these are the type of things that I'm seeing every single day just using social media. And I think that the persistence of these vile people who are white supremacists, who are antagonists, who are Christian nationalists, whatever have you, the persistence that they are putting forward is the persistence that I feel I need to match, and if not match, to overpower with my desire to educate people and to be in community with educators and scholars and writers and researchers and thinkers who have come before me, so that people actually can have truth and cultivate good ideas, good values, good morals that can then benefit everyone. Because if we even stop for a moment, a day, an hour, then you can have millions and millions and millions of people being fed misinformation or disinformation. So we just have to continue fighting.
Well, thank you. Well, as a librarian, I want to say you just gave me hope, because mis, dis, and malinformation. That's our thing, right? And so I just want to thank you, and I hope that our audience takes some hope away from this conversation, hope for the future. Hope you will go and follow Kahlil on social media, on TikTok. I know many of you may not have TikTok, but you go get TikTok. You can follow one account on TikTok. And then, of course, we hope that you will read Dr. Joseph's work and be inspired, and then share it with the generations, within your generations, the generations that come after you, and ensure that the truth will set us all free. So with that, I will turn it over. Do we have time for questions, Carl? If anyone has any questions, I am happy to. I'm going to ask Carl to be the mic.
Also, I just wanted to plug, if anyone wants to read my work, I have a newsletter where I post a lot of my videos, but then also write short articles. If you go to historycan'thide.com, there's no apostrophe, and if you want to write it down, History Can't Hide, HISTORYCANTHIDE.com.
Thank you so much for coming today. I wanted to know, how do you feel about critical race theory? And do you feel as though that it has watered down our history? And what impact will it have on future historians?
Well, I would say, so critical race theory, I think this connects with what Kahlil was saying about just misinformation and disinformation. So critical race theory, in fact, was just, it's something that people like Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell and these sort of huge legal minds, legal theorists, law professors, it came out of a critical legal studies framework. And all critical race theory was and was law professors, not just blacks, some white, Hispanic as well, making an argument that race and racism was a central part of the law and lawmaking in the United States, right? And globally, but in the United States. And the reason why that was novel was that these were black people who went to some of the best law schools in the country. Some of them later taught at Harvard and stuff. And what they noticed was that when they were going through law school, even in civil rights law professors never talked about racism and race. Even when they were doing cases on Reconstruction and different stuff. They just sort of isolated the law from race and racism. And these folks were just saying, you just can't do that. You know what I mean? You know, race shapes the way in which the law functions, the way in which it's interpreted, the way in which it impacts the infrastructure and the superstructure of the United States, right? This was not being taught in every single law school, by the way, too. This was a conservative blogger really just utilized critical race theory, and the word caught on with disgruntled Republicans and conservatives to say somehow this was being taught to your kindergartner. and they were being indoctrinated in critical race theory. So so right now, critical race theory, like the term woke and DEI, has been distorted to the point where it's no longer recognizable. When I was growing up, they did the same thing to the word political correctness and affirmative action, right? And so, you know, what they're calling critical race theory, I would call it Black history and American history and Hispanic history and queer history and women's history, right? Labor history, they could call critical race theory, because it's coming from a perspective where there's a critique of the way in which power in the United States has historically oppressed and marginalized different groups of people. So that's all it is. But we're in a very, very tough time, because this is what authoritarians do and autocrats. So the idea, like Kahlil was saying, about people being intellectually lazy, the idea that facts don't matter, the suspension of Jimmy Kimmel, but the firing of Steve Colbert. You know, this is all about taking over free civil discourse, the takeover of the universities, the lawsuits against CBS and the corporations, the lawsuits against the lawyers. What they've done is toppled very well-resourced elites who could stand up to them and say that the only way you can function in society now is under these terms and under these rules. The irony for all of us is the only thing that makes this possible is white supremacy. That's the irony. Patriarchy and white supremacy, because this is patriarchal white supremacy par excellence, because even the women, the white women who are part of this, including the Attorney General and different stuff, they're only in it to the extent that these white men allow them to be in it. You see? So they have to know their role. They have to know their role. So all of this is only happening because patriarchal white supremacy is just so powerful that it continued to exist even with Barack and Michelle Obama. The reason why I did the 63 book is that the only reason we get to Barack and Michelle Obama is because of this year, right? And some of us, and this is on us who are older, the young people are just stepping into this history. Some of us, and I think including the Obamas, thought erroneously all the bad days were over. You see what I'm saying? So some of us got caught, not with our hands in the cookie jar, but we got caught thinking that because you went to Yale, Harvard, and present company excluded, talking about older people older than me, the Obamas are 63, 64, they thought it was all good, you know? And some of us warned them, because BLM was in the White House with Obama, and I write about this in the Third Reconstruction, and they were warning them that, look, the criminal justice system, this is a canary in the coal mine, this whole thing is ready to collapse. He didn't believe it in 2014 when he met up with Phil Agnew and these activists, some of whom are friends of mine, who I know. And some of us didn't believe it. Like, I voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Some of us were like, no, I'm not voting for Hillary in 2016. I was like, well, what about not just the Supreme Court? I was telling friends of mine on the left, black people, some of them professors who are super paid, right? I was like, how are you gonna not vote for her morally where all these people who we don't know are gonna be killed if he's elected? They didn't care. Some of them have publicly apologized for this, but all these people have died because of these decisions. Because some of us got too comfortable, right? Thinking that it's all gonna be good, we're good, right? We got Obama, we got Kamala, we've got all of it, right? But now we're facing this new reality that some of us are complicit in. I think young people less so, because they're stepping into history for the first time. So they're trying to figure this out, just like when we were 18, 19, 20, 21, we were trying to figure it out, but there were more signposts for us when we were trying to figure it out, right? And there was more of an ethical, moral compass that the United States still had, even in the 1980s and 90s. So think of Reaganism and the critique against Reaganism. That almost looks like good times compared to what's happening right now. You see what I'm saying? And the reason why we still had the moral compass is because of black people and what we did in '63.
Coming on your right.
Could you tell me, both of you, what your definition of cancel culture is? Because it's one of those terms that has gotten away with itself or something, and I don't know what the meaning of it is. Just like with race theory, I have no idea.
I think when people are talking about cancel culture, it's traditionally a word that was created by the right, so like the Republican Party you can think of, as a way to define these moments where, I'll give an example. Let's say I'm a CEO of a large company and I get caught with a tweet from 2023 that says, look at my N-word best friend, and I'm white, right? Like I say the N-word publicly. And then a bunch of people on the internet who are black or who are Democrats or progressive then call my company and say, oh, he said the N-word and it's racist, so he needs to get fired. And then my company decides to fire me. So cancel culture is how the right defines people, like people on the internet or people on social media. I would say holding people accountable for racist things they did in the past. However, on the right, like on the Republican Party, they see it as an overreach and they see it as a way of silencing free speech. However, I believe the irony and what makes, for example, something like cancel culture different from what we saw happen to Jimmy Kimmel is that cancel culture, quote unquote, is something where people, like the citizens of a country, the payers, the taxpayers, the people who are buying things from companies are making their voices heard in a democratic way. They're going on social media, they're protesting, they're sending messages out there. Whereas what happened to Jimmy Kimmel, for example, which is, I think, more egregious than anything that's happened to a white racist in the past, is that the president, someone who actually has authority, used the FCC chair, someone who also has authority, to then get someone removed. So there was a tweet that the difference between cancel culture is that cancel culture is bottom up, whereas authoritarianism is top down.
That's good.
Hi. I'm probably one of the oldest people here. I'm 87. So.
You look great.
Thank you. But I would like to begin with what was first said. Children come to families first, however they are configured. And it is the responsibility of that family to give them a sense of who they are, what their family represented, the history of their family, certain things that people in the family have done. But I was told, you are a Hackett, and you're supposed to go out there and be the best that you can be, and we're here to help you. That's number one. Number two, because I was educated 100 years or so more, we talked about our civil rights as citizens in the United States, the importance of voting, the importance of registering to vote when we finally could register, and to pay attention to what people who want to represent you are saying. Now that was in elementary school. We also read the newspaper, and we were asked to give our opinions. What were people trying to get us to believe? So you gave your opinion, but what you were doing more importantly was doing critical thinking. Nobody challenges children or people in general to think critically. We all have a right to our opinion, but we don't have the right to be wrong about the facts. And that's what you have to think about. So since I was in the 60s, 63, and the March on Washington and all that, we fell asleep because things started opening up, and DuPont was hiring above the elevator operator and the custodian, and we thought we had made it. And then they opened up some housing, reduced the ability, increased the ability for some of us to buy housing outside of the city of Wilmington. We fell asleep because we thought that was our life. But we were just being placated. We fell asleep. And so now our children today, because I have great-grandchildren, are like the wind socks blowing in the wind. Any which way you tell them, well, that's okay, because I don't want to think. That's the danger. We need to get our children and our neighbors back to thinking critically. Forget all those definitions that sound, oh, that sounds exciting. If I could say I don't believe in critical thinking, I don't even know what the hell that is. But I do know that somebody is holding me back or my grandchildren back because they are black, and I'm not standing for it.
Any other questions?
I got a statement. I don't got no question.
You got a question?
Like, you had said something about hope, right? What do you think is the main substance of hope is?
For me, I think the main substance of hope is our social political activism and just doing the work to try to build that beloved community. I think it's our personal as well, in terms of my mother imbued me, took me and my brother to the church, New Bethel Baptist Church. Shout out to New Bethel Baptist Church in Queens. And that was real. That was something that she really believed in. And the reason why that was important is I grew up with a mother who walked the talk. So she was hugely disciplined. She didn't drink alcohol. She didn't smoke cigarettes. She wasn't out in the streets. She lived her truth, right? So with her, and it wasn't that she was a perfect person, but she didn't have major contradictions. So I never saw what she articulated to me and my brother, how we should live our lives. I never saw her not walking that talk. So I found hope in that. That was real. That was real for me. So for me, hope is in this idea of dignity, that we all have it, that we should all, and this is Baldwin, we should be thinking about and loving other people's children as much as we love our own, which is a lot to do. And that's what, when King says that nonviolence is for courageous people and not for weak people, and he's pushing back against Malcolm X in Los Angeles in '63, what he's saying is true, and I love Malcolm. I've written a biography of Malcolm. But he's saying that in that case, in that instance, Malcolm didn't understand the power of getting people together who were going to put their bodies on the line, because if they tried to do it violently, they couldn't win. That was the whole thing. It wasn't, and that's still the case. That's still the case. So he was saying the hope was being in, it's not turning the other cheek. That's how the New York Times described it. Nonviolence was always powerful, muscular, and coercive, which is why King was assassinated. If he was such a weak leader, why do you think he didn't live to 100? If everybody loved him, why do you think he was just shot in the face in Memphis, Tennessee at the Lorraine Motel, Thursday, April 4th, 1968, just past 6 p.m. Memphis time? Why did that happen? So the hope is in doing the work. The hope is in doing the work and being in community like this, but even after leaving this, it's in reading, it's in being a critical thinker, it's in preparing yourself to have the resources where you can be an exemplar. I'm a father, I'm a husband, and everything that I do, including the things that I don't do, is because of my family, right? So I walk the talk every day, right? And doing that is a discipline. People love to go off the beaten path and say, hey, I'm going to do this thing I'm not supposed to do. So you're doing it because you want to be an exemplar for your own kids. So my kids see me and they know that I always do the thing that I say I'm going to do. I'm always in the place where I say I'm going to be. I don't lie to them. I don't lie to myself. And I'm always trying to do the right thing. Not because I want people to like me, but because my mom instilled a specific discipline on me that said the dignity of yourself, you recognizing your own dignity, makes you want to be a service-oriented leader for other people, right? And you find real power and strength and, yes, hope in that.
I'm fine going to that. I think there's a lot of power there.
But I think we're going to have to wrap up our Q&A. So unless you'd like to close us out, Kahlil?
Is the way just maybe like the last question then? We have one more question. Okay, left.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you both because we were talking about hope. And in 1963, my father was on Long Island, New York, organizing through SNCC Corps and the NAACP for the March on Washington. I was a little girl. I used to go to the picket line with my dad on his shoulders before that day. And at the time, the FBI was tapping phones and doing all sorts of things. So I would answer the phone, even as a very young girl, in a particular way, always like it was a business, always professionally, and I would write down messages. So I was really early literate, but it does give me hope to hear both of you. And I love that you're doing what you're doing. I know you said no statements, you wanted a question. What do you think the impact on TikTok particularly of this takeover by the billionaire? Because I understand that in China there's a lot of restriction, there are penalties and consequences for posting the wrong thing on the internet or looking at the wrong material on the internet. And I myself deleted TikTok because of my concerns about the app. And you found a home there and a lot of followers. Would you consider using your computer skills to create a platform that was free of some of this interference and control? And just that's the question. What do you think about TikTok?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's pros and cons, right? So there are some platforms and websites that are completely free of any sort of oversight or moderation or people being able to manipulate what's going on. And what you'll find is instead of those being places of like great discourse and intellectual conversations, those are honestly some of the worst places on the internet where people are just saying the most vile things about each other. There's not much. It makes you a bit pessimistic, at least about young people on the internet, but with anonymous, the ability to be anonymous and the incentive to be as popular and to get as many likes as possible, people often gravitate towards like the worst thing they can say for the shock value. When it comes to TikTok, I think that there's a boogeyman of China that America has kind of put up for us. And it happened back when the Chinese Exclusion Act was being written in like the 1800s. It's happened during the Cold War with communism. And it's happening again now that China is becoming a competitor in the world stage. There's a boogeyman that's saying that, oh, China's like the worst place, it's authoritarian, you can't say your opinions. And there's some aspect where that's true, don't get me wrong. China's not a democracy through and through. But the thing to remember is that the United States is not either. So when it comes to like these platforms, I try to take the good with the bad. So I have gotten videos removed about Black history from a moderator that's in the United States, like an American moderator. The United States version of TikTok is run in the United States. The data is being stored in the United States, So we're seeing these issues come up wherever they are. So the challenge for me, and I think for everyone, and I think a theme that can be sort of used as a through line is the idea of adaptation. So we get the cards that we're dealt with and how we're going to play those cards in order to, in my case, inform the young people, in your case, inform everyone with deep research, and everyone here's case, like the new generations, teaching them, instilling values within them. It's all about how we're able to adapt with what we're given, and that's just something that I try to do every day.
Thank you, Kahlil. And thank you all for being here this evening, and thank you for your patience once again. As recently released Freedom Season, and so it is my pleasure to introduce him to Wilmington and invite him to the stage for our conversation this evening.